The only commander that remained to lead our cavalry was General Courteau, a good enough officer on the parade ground, but without that prestige which wins the unhesitating confidence of the soldiers. Besides, our mounted troops at the time did not exceed 2,000 strong, while the English cavalry was almost twice as numerous. Otherwise, the forces of the two armies were almost equal, that is, in infantry and artillery, except that the English had in their train a few thousand Spanish volunteers. The Duke of Ragusa, our commander, was really a talented general. He was very brave, and was greatly beloved for the good care he took of his soldiers. His division generals were all officers of high merit, as their names will suffice to prove: Foy, Clausel, Ferret, Morcoun, and Bonnet. The brigadier generals almost equalled them in reputation and in bravery, and for that matter the whole army was but too anxious to meet the Britons in the open field. Therefore the order of the day, which was issued by Marshal Marmont on the 22nd of July, and which I read myself to the 200 riders of the escort, produced on everybody an excellent impression. In it the Marshal reminded his troops that the English army, which for the last 2 years never faced us except when backed by armed breastworks, had suddenly changed its tactics, that it had at last decided to come up to the scratch and fight us at close quarters, and that the Emperor, although now 500 leagues away from the army of Portugal, was intently observing the brave men that composed it. The Marshal added that he had united his army to march against the English and do them battle to the cry of Vive l'Empereur. The British have named this contest the Battle of Salamanca. The French call it the Battle of the Arapiles, the name of the two conspicuous mountains distant from each other about a cannon's range. These eminences are situated in the middle of the plain, where we fought the whole day long. One was at the extreme edge of the English formation, and was occupied by General Wellington and his staff. The other was right in the middle of our lines. Marshal Marmont and his staff, having their horses below, had climbed to the top of the latter. Towards 11 o'clock of this beautiful summer day, the Duke of Ragusa, with field-glass in hand, was intently surveying the English position. His butler had just spread upon the grass the silver tableware containing the Marshal's cold breakfast, and His Excellency, with his aides-de-camp and chief of staff, were about sitting down to a comfortable meal, when some shells, discharged from the hand mortars of the opposite mountain, terminated very abruptly their luncheon, not quite begun. The English commander had masked a battery of these pieces by interposing an infantry battalion, which he at once removed out of the way when the firing began. Falling into our mountain position entirely unexpected, the projectiles forced us to hurry down to the plain to recover our horses. I had already mounted when I heard the Duke of Ragusa's voice loudly calling out, "Nicholas! Nicholas, my horse!" Nicholas was His Excellency's chief groom, but he did not happen to be at hand when the Marshal reached the plain. I at once dismounted, and offered my horse to the Duke, who accepted it on account of the critical circumstances. He had already put a foot in the stirrup, when the groom rushed forward, leading by the bridle his master's charger. The commander returned me my horse, and started on a gallop to reach the line of battle. Having first, however, given me the order to ride over to General Foy, and direct him to bring his division forward, I at once fulfilled the mission confided to me. As I was returning to the escort, I noticed a number of men and horses of my own regiment, from which I had been absent for so long a time, yielding to the natural desire to obtain some news of my former friends, I rode over to a group of chasseurs who were holding the bridles of relief horses. "What are you doing here?" I inquired of Narbonne, an officer of the 13th Chasseurs, whom I found comfortably seated near the sutler's wagon, holding a sausage in one hand and a bottle of brandy in the other. "Can't you see, dear comrade?" he coolly answered. "I am having my breakfast. Don't you wish to join me?" "Sorry, I must refuse," I said, "but I am in a great hurry. Just pass over the bottle that I may wet my whistle, for it is terribly hot today." After gulping down a draught of brandy, I thanked him, adding, as I returned the flask, "You are mighty well off here. The cannonballs won't reach you. Do you belong to the army transport?" "My dear Parquin, do you want me to fight against those English who were so kind to my family and self when we took refuge in England in '93? I could not even think of being so ungrateful. If people want me to fight," he added, trying to appear as ferocious as he could, "let them put me in front of some other nation. The Austrians, for example." "Oh, that's it," I said, bursting into a laugh and spurring my horse to the gallop. "I suppose you would like to pick what we call a German quarrel with those other fellows." This Narbonne was a young man from the noble Saint-Germain suburb, and when one day galloping rather close to the Emperor, who was driving to Malmaison, managed to fling dust into His Majesty's carriage. Next morning he received his brevet as a second lieutenant, and was sent to the army, where he never raised the slightest dust of any kind, for no useful service could be got out of him. Finally he was sent back home, and I believe that since then he has become insane. Marshal Marmont, in imitation of the English general, had some light artillery carried by hand to the top of his own mountain, and there finally established his headquarters for the day. Not having need of any escort on this vantage ground, he ordered our major, Monsieur Denis, to lead his 200 troopers wherever they might be found useful. The major placed us at once in array, at the right of the 3rd Hussars, where we stood for a whole hour under the fire of the enemy's artillery, which did us some damage. Finally we were relieved from this uncomfortable position, and were delighted to receive the order to charge a regiment of heavy cavalry wearing the historic scarlet coats. I was just returning from this charge, when I observed, not over 100 paces from me, a chasseur of the 26th Regiment, also a member of the escort, who was closely pursued by 2 English soldiers. "Face the enemy, chasseur!" I cried out, as I rushed to his assistance, but the chasseur didn't stop, and one of the English cavalrymen, who had evidently lost control of his steed, tilted violently against the right flank of mine, so that both horses fell together. Then the second English rider quickly approached, calling to me, "Prisoner, you are my prisoner," and directing me with his sabre to march in front of him. The memory of the time when I was a prisoner in Russia suddenly came back to me. On noticing that my antagonist failed to make use of his pistol, I myself strained every nerve to ward off his sabre cuts, having first managed to crawl from under my horse, which at once darted wildly away towards the escort. I was fencing vigorously to get a cut at the legs of my adversary's horse, when the return of my own steed to the escort without me caused 2 of our men to ride out to my assistance. Seeing me engaged on foot with an enemy who was mounted, they rushed towards us at full gallop. As soon as he saw them coming, the Englishman gave up the fight, but not before aiming at my wrist a vicious sabre cut. Happily my leather gauntlet was so thick as to weaken the blow, otherwise I should certainly have had my hand cleft off. In the ardour of conflict, I was hardly 25 years old at the time, I thought little of the blow, but as I lifted my hand onto the saddle peak to again mount horse, I became conscious that my right wrist was utterly powerless. Accordingly, I had to mount on the wrong side, and galloped off at once, only too well pleased to escape with so slight a wound. When we reached the spot whence the 2 chasseurs had started to my rescue, we found only a single horseman, who was instructed to tell us that the escort had hastened along to the foot of the mountain, where the general-in-chief was said to be lying severely wounded. From there we had to proceed to the ambulance, which was established in the city of Alba de Tormes. The journey was over a league long, of which the greater part was through thick woods. We put our horses to a gallop, and yet had barely time to reach our friends, for the swarming cavalry of the enemy managed to outride our left wing, and were pushing in the direction of the La Tormes bridge. Lieutenant General Marquin fortunately noticed this movement, and by throwing some troops into the woods, cut off the advance of the English in that direction. I had lost so much blood while galloping, having the sabre hanging from my wrist by its sword knot, that I could certainly have fainted right out of the saddle if my chasseurs had not noticed the danger and lifted me to the ground. The enemy was coming closer and closer, and everything seemed to indicate that we were losing the battle. The chasseurs had nothing with which to revive my strength, and could only splash on my face, while I still remained prostrate and insensible, some water from a neighbouring brook. Suddenly these words, "What a pity it is to abandon our brave officer to the enemy," pierced my drowsy brain, and caused me to open my eyes. On noticing this, the chasseurs explained, "Cheer up, Adjutant Major," and then, almost carrying me, placed me again on horseback. It was past 6 o'clock when we crossed the bridge, and at last entered the city of Alba de Tormes. The Marshal had arrived there at 4 o'clock. Although very serious, his wound was not mortal. A shell had crushed his right arm and broken 2 of his ribs. The surgeons concluded not to risk the amputation of the arm, while knowing it must remain forever useless. General Clausel took command of the army, and by his able manoeuvring saved it from further disaster. Toward midnight, the division of Foy, which had been kept in reserve, was massed into a square, and proved a rampart against the enemy, who must have been very thankful that the Duke of Ragusa, who had postponed attacking them for several days, did not delay doing so just 1 day more. King Joseph and Marshal Soult having, in fact, now arrived to help him with an army of 40,000, of whom 10,000 were cavalry. All things considered, the English had to pay very dear for their small victory. On our side, there was mourning for the deaths of General Ferret and Thomiers, and of Colonel Jardet, one of the Marshal's aides-de-camp. We retreated in good order towards Valladolid and Burgos, an English division following us closely without attempting to interfere with the movement. Charles Denis Parquin, 20th Chasseurs à Cheval.